Welcome to today's PAVE virtual panel, which adds to our All AVs Are Local series, where we highlight specific projects taking place across the country and the problems that they're working to solve. Today's panel takes us to the rural roadways of Iowa, where the University of Iowa's National Advanced Driver Simulator is running a shuttle project to add to the body of research around rural AV applications. My name is Tabitha Colter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and today's moderator. I'm excited to introduce today's two guests. First, we have Dr. Dan McGehee, Associate Professor of Industrial and Systems Engineering at the University of Iowa. Dan, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Tabitha.
Great. And our second guest is Omar Ahmad, Deputy Director of the National Advanced Driver Simulator. Omar, great to have you with us as well.
Thank you, Tabitha.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get started with some context for this project and its importance. Dan, starting with you, I know you've been conducting research on driver performance, distraction, and technology development for many years, often helping policymakers improve government safety standards and laws. Can you help set the scene for us on what makes rural transportation unique compared to suburban and urban transportation that most research centers on?
Yes, absolutely. And thanks, Tabitha, for having us today. And thanks to Ed and Jade for helping support this great set of meetings. I think providing some context around the University of Iowa doesn't portray sort of the high-tech Silicon Valley side of things, but the National Advanced Driving Simulator that I've directed now for about 5 years and came to Iowa nearly 30 years ago to do human factors and automotive safety research provides a backdrop to not only high-fidelity simulation in an $80 million simulator and its associated labs, but also a whole network of on-road experimental vehicles that are really designed, as you said, our expertise is to study that relationship between the human and the machine. So most of our expertise is in human factors. That's my area of expertise over the last 30 years and developing some of the original ADAS systems 30 years ago. And the University of Iowa set one of the very first automated driving studies on the predecessor to the National Advanced Driving Simulator, the Iowa Driving Simulator, for the automated highway system research program that was demonstrated in Berkeley and in California. So we've been doing this kind of technology development, test and evaluation for a very long time. So the most recent project that we have on automated driving systems for rural America is really an extension of the long history of our work doing that. And it just so happens that we live in a rural state. So much of the US is covered by rural roads. The most fatalities occur on rural roads where we have high speed, narrow lanes and so forth. So it really provides us the opportunity to really bring the technologies that we've been studying for several decades now and host them on our local roads and really give access to Iowans and the broader country access to these first very public data.
Absolutely. And Omar, as the project manager for this specific Iowa Shuttle project, could you kind of provide some more information on how this project fits into that broader framework that Dan was just outlining?
Yeah, definitely. So, as Dan described, automated vehicle research has been done at this university and others for quite a long time. And when the government announced the ADS demonstration grant opportunities, we really took a broad look at what was happening in other places around the country and what we felt, what we thought where the gaps were at. And so one thing was clear that when we looked at demonstrations that were taking place, rural areas were really largely ignored. And from our perspective, when we look at safety data, while it's true that a smaller portion of the population lives in rural areas, about 19%, half of all traffic fatalities occur in those rural areas. So if automated vehicles are going to realize their promise of improving safety, then really it needs to be safety for everybody on all different types of roadways. And so the project that we're working on really tries to look at how we can improve safety in rural areas through automated vehicles. And the goal of this project is to identify both the challenges and the opportunities that exist for making that happen. A second important component of our project is the people in those rural areas. So the US population is aging, and older people are expected to outnumber younger people in the near future. And a lot of older folks live in rural areas where, as they age, being able to get around is equivalent to freedom and independence. The challenge with rural areas is that they have little or no access to public transportation. And so there's very few options for being able to get around. And with that in mind, our project utilizes a transit shuttle bus. And this represents the type of vehicle that could potentially provide a much needed service to folks in those areas.
Absolutely. And kind of getting to that point about the people that you're trying to serve in that community, who are you recruiting to participate in this project?
Right. So we are recruiting people who are over the age of 65 that could potentially be served by a vehicle like this. But we're also recruiting people who are 25 and over, but then have a vision or a mobility impairment. Once again, providing access to means of transportation that allows people to move from one location to another, whether it's between rural areas or from a rural area to a regional center, is going to be so important moving forward.
Absolutely. And Omar provided a really good overview of sort of the goals of the project and some of those challenges that rural populations face. But Dan, anything else to add there as far as that scope goes?
No, I think Omar said it nicely. I think what's very important to us more broadly is really making sure that rural constituents get first access to this technology. We generally read about Silicon Valley and Arizona and big urban areas, but this is really an opportunity for us to get to the heart of the heartland and give those rural constituents access to these technologies today.
I'd like to, make another point, and that is that there might be a perception out there that if we can make these vehicles work on interstates and in urban settings, that somehow that will mean that these vehicles will work everywhere. And our from what we've learned so far is that the challenges that these vehicles are going to encounter in rural areas are going to be they're going to be somewhat similar, but there are going to be many situations that are vastly different than what we would encounter on an interstate or in an urban setting. So if we only have development and testing being done in urban locations, then we're going to have solutions that cater to those locations. And once again, it's so important that we have vehicles that work everywhere for everybody.
Yeah. And speaking of that work you guys are doing, I know you completed phase 1 of the project in November, finishing 12, I believe, data collection drives on a 47-mile route within 4 different communities.
Right.
I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the big picture findings from that phase 1.
Right. So we, as you mentioned, we've completed 12 drives out of a total of 80. And our goal is to complete these drives over a duration of 2 years. And the idea is that with each phase of data collection, the capabilities of the vehicle, the automation capabilities of the vehicle will improve with each phase. So we've only done the first phase. And what we've learned is that from one point of view, automation to a large extent works well on interstates and even on undivided highways. But we've also learned that the automation has many points of failure, and it is by no means the type of technology where it can be utilized without supervision. And so what our testing has shown us is that the safety driver a dedicated safety driver that is operating this vehicle and is solely responsible for doing nothing but either actively operating the vehicle or actively monitoring the automation is so important, just because there's so many different points of failure. Secondly, because of the unique goals of our project, we paired the safety driver with a co-pilot as well, because we're very interested in our project. We're very interested in documenting where things are working, but also even more importantly, where they're not working well. And so when it comes to flagging events, making notes about special situations, that really cannot be done by the safety driver, because all that they should be doing is operating the vehicle or monitoring it. And for that reason, we have a co-pilot as well, whose job it is to serve as a second pair of eyes on the roadway, but then also to do that special logging. So from a vehicle point of view, yes, it works well quite often as long as you're on an interstate or on a highway. But the moment you come up upon an intersection, a ramp, a speed limit change that is unexpected or sudden, we are having to take the vehicle out of automation and safely bring the vehicle back under control, and to change speeds or go through intersections or take ramps. We expect that some of these things will get better as we move forward with our testing. Another thing that we've learned is, so we've completed 12 drives, and in those 12 drives, we've had 24 participants ride with us. And so certainly this data, we have to take it with a grain of salt, because it's only 24 participants. But nevertheless, what we're learning is that people's perception and trust in automated vehicles is trending towards increasing when we compare their responses before they participate and take the ride versus afterwards.
It's really interesting. And I'd like to maybe dive in a little bit more to a point that you made, Omar, which is that that sometimes this technology isn't working and you're having to turn it over to a safety driver. And I think it's easy to kind of hear something like that and be shocked or concerned, or that leading to maybe less trust or less interest. And I would just love any kind of input you two have on the importance of kind of being transparent about that, and how that sort of relates to general safety goals when we think about kind of adapting this type of technology. Dan?
Yeah, I think what's really critical about this project, it's really the first public demonstration where all of the data are public. All of the demonstrations that are going on in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Tempe are proprietary. And so when a vehicle makes an error, those are not shared with the public. And certainly one error is not necessarily catastrophic, but there are certainly trends that you can start to notice. Each of these vehicles has a different personality, much like ADAS systems sometimes have different personalities. So I think it's really critical that this project share those data with the public. So at hearings, for instance, that occurred today in Washington in the Transportation Committee, we will be able to share those data and have a much more detailed conversation about safety and the implementation of these kinds of technologies.
Right, and keeping with the spirit of transparency, when we were ramping up to put our vehicle on the roadway for this project, we made every effort to reach out to those communities, to the leaders, to the city councils, and to the general public. And we described what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. And once we were able to spend time explaining why this type of testing is so important, the amount of positive feedback that we got and excitement that we heard, once again, both from the leaders, but also from the general public. So some of that outreach was in the form of making presentations at city councils, but some of that outreach was attending county fairs and city parades, where we took the vehicle, we parked it at the county fair, and people were able to walk in and see everything, touch everything, ask lots of questions. And this was really a great way to engage the public, and also for us to better understand what some of their concerns might be, because as researchers, sometimes we can be a little bit disconnected from the people that our research is trying to ultimately serve. And so getting out there is just so important to the entire process.
Absolutely. And you mentioned some questions that you got asked when you went to the county fair, and I'm sure that the riders also had questions for the safety operator and the co-pilot.
Yeah.
What kind of questions are you typically hearing from the riders and the public? Any particular comments or ones that tend to stand out to you?
Right. So, I first of all, when we have riders in the vehicle, they sit in the passenger area, and in the bulkhead, there's a monitor that shows them whether the vehicle is being driven under automation or whether it's being actually driven by the safety driver. So the screen alternates between being clear and being blue, and blue means that it's under automation. And some of the questions that our riders had was, for instance, why are the driver's hands on the wheel even if the vehicle is in automation? And once again, this was something that was part of our safety protocol. Because there are so many different points of failure, we want to minimize the time that it takes to take the vehicle from automation to under full control of the driver. And for that reason, our safety drivers keep their hands on the wheel. But from the perspective of a rider, it maybe diminishes maybe some of the what you would expect from an automated vehicle, right? Because we call them driverless vehicles. In fact, there's even commercials that you can watch right now where people are clapping along to a song while the vehicle is being driven under automation. Another really kind of down-to-earth question was, how long will it be until I can own one of these vehicles? And that's for sure for a researcher, that's a sobering question, because now we're being asked to predict when somebody can own a product like this one day. And our answer can be, has to be measured. It's been a great conversation to have with riders. And if I may also add to the question, there were some really interesting comments from the riders as well. And the riders noticed that the driver was actively taking the vehicle out of automation when we were doing in-town driving. And that's, again, as I described before, the vehicle is right now under automation, mostly on interstates and in highway settings. But our goal will be to have it under automation in future phases in the in-town portions. And then finally, participants said that their experience was fascinating. They felt safe the entire time. And one participant even said that their experience was boring, but as it should be.
I know that's one we've heard a couple times too with demos. That's always not a bad thing to hear that, oh, that was a little boring or not that exciting. And that's fascinating. And I know too, Omar, you briefly mentioned what you have upcoming for the next phases. So could you talk about, what's next for phase 2 and beyond that for the project?
Oh, for sure. So one of the things that, as I mentioned, the vehicle operates under automation, largely under automation in interstate settings. But we've had to turn off the automation when we're taking the on-ramp or the off-ramp. So phase 2 will attempt to address that. Another thing that phase 2 will attempt to address is the overall performance of the vehicle when it is on a highway and there's a speed change. Especially as you go from a higher speed limit to a lower speed limit. In the initial phase of testing, the speed changes were very abrupt. And for that reason, we would take it out of automation so that we can make it for a smoother transition. But we've addressed some of those abrupt transitions, so we hope to keep the vehicle under automation longer. Future phases of testing will involve urban driving, will involve navigating signalized intersections under automation, making turns under automation, and also interactions with infrastructure and with potentially with slow-moving vehicles like school buses.
Yeah. I know we're looking forward to seeing those continued results. And as you pointed out, Dan, the fact that this data will be public and available is, something that we find really valuable, which actually kind of leads me to the next question, which is, we touched a little bit earlier that rural roadways are often underrepresented in automation research, and that this project is an important step toward furthering that understanding. Dan, how does AV technology and testing stand to benefit from this type of continued research in rural areas?
Well, the roadway environment is very different in rural areas. We have much narrower roadways. We don't have paint, we have gravel. All those kinds of things are very challenging for today's sensor systems for vehicles. We also have very different kinds of traffic. We have combines and weird looking tractors and weird looking sprayers that don't fit the normal kinds of templates that we train computers to look for. We spend a lot of time training for what a bicycle looks like, what a pedestrian looks like, what different kinds of cars, passenger vehicles, pickup trucks, heavy trucks look like. But there's some really odd looking vehicles that are running around our roadways. So really understanding that the next generation of digital infrastructure is critical in terms of high definition mapping is very critical. So we can operate on those, especially gravel roads and non-marked roadways, which make up a really large percentage of the roadway environment in not only the US, but North America, and our friends in Canada as well. Our DOT director, Scott Marler, who just testified in a House hearing on automated vehicles, used a term that I'm going to use his quote, that these high definition mapping systems essentially digitally paint the lane lines in. And I think that's really a nice visualization for how high definition maps are going to be critical for the future digital infrastructure. So right now we're talking about how we're in a great need for improving the roads and bridges and other physical infrastructure, but we really have to prepare for the next generation of digital infrastructure. That's not like you do a map once. You have to sustain these high definition maps because the roadway environment changes, whether it's a construction zone or lane marking chains and so forth. Those all have to be considered in that next generation of digital infrastructure.
Absolutely. I know we hear those type of questions a lot coming from the public, including things you just touched on of, how do AVs handle aspects like gravel and unpaved roads? Omar, anything to kind of add on that specific topic from so far the work in the shuttle?
Yeah, the gravel roads are certainly a big challenge. And when you have a high definition map, certainly you can digitally paint the lane lines in where they don't exist in the actual world, and the vehicle can certainly follow those lane lines. But the challenge with gravel roads is that gravel roads are typically narrow, and they're being utilized by traffic moving in both directions. But gravel roads are not very busy. So generally, when you're on a gravel road, you may ride or drive your vehicle in the center of the road itself, because it may only be 1.5 lane widths wide as opposed to 2 lane widths wide. And then as you approach an oncoming vehicle, both of you shift over to the right as you pass each other. So what I'm describing here is a behavioral thing that humans do when they're on gravel roads. So an HD map is not going to do that for you. And this is really where the automation software needs to become smarter, because yes, it's going to enable you to know where you are in the lane, but nevertheless that logic and those manners that humans may have, those all have to be programmed in, and they may have to be programmed in slightly different ways for the type of gravel road that you're on. And this is just one of many special cases and conditions that are going to have to be programmed in over time.
Absolutely. And you both have kind of discussed some different strategies to engaging with the community when you're doing this type of work and making sure that the results and the information is being shared. And Dan, I'm curious, as this research continues to advance our understanding of rural applications and advanced technologies, how can we make sure that we are engaging with the rural communities to make sure their voice is heard as well?
Yeah, as Omar mentioned, we work really hard to engage local leadership. And in fact, far before the Automated Driving System for Rural America project, we frequently met with city leaders, briefed city councilors, had them ride in our vehicles, because what we don't want to happen is we have some really funny looking vehicles too that have all these different crazy cameras and sensors on them. And so when a vehicle like that drives down the middle of the road, it's not uncommon for them to call the city and say, hey, what are these guys doing? And we want them to be able to answer that question so that they're not caught off guard. We want to demonstrate these technologies to make sure that questions and concerns from the community can be answered basically, and then we provide resources for people to contact us directly. We've had people just show up in our lobby saying, hey, what are you guys doing? In fact, one of the hallmarks of our core values is really a dedication to community outreach to make sure that we are communicating with the public what we're doing. We want to make sure that we bring them along for the ride in this research. And I think that's something that's also very different than when you work for a big computer company or an automotive company, is that you're unable to do that.
We also have a quarterly newsletter. And if anyone is interested in receiving the quarterly newsletter, you can go to our website, the ADS for Rural America website, and sign up for the newsletter.
Great. And Omar, I'd love to hear from your perspective, what is the timeline for the rest of this research on the project and sharing results, or what can people who, subscribe to that newsletter or want to just follow this project, what can they expect to hear?
Definitely. So we have about a year and a half left in the timeline of the project itself. But when it comes to sharing data, we expect to have a data portal up and running within the next couple of months. And the data portal will be accessible via the same website that my colleague just shared in the chat below. The data portal will allow you access to the data and more information about what kind of data is available. And we plan on sharing everything that we collect. There'll be a mechanism for getting to that data.
That's great. We are getting very close to time. So before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from both of you guys. If you could leave our audience with one final impression or one takeaway from this conversation, what would it be? Let's start with you, Dan.
Well, as a person who's been in university research my whole career, engaging with the public, no matter who you're with, even if you work for an auto company, talk to your communications people to see how you can talk about what you do. There are certainly some public elements, but we study in what I do in human factors engineering, sort of trust and automation at the micro level, so at the individual level, but there's also trust at the macro level. And certainly we see early surveys where people are a little edgy about what the future holds with regards to these kinds of vehicles. So it's our collective responsibility, I think, to educate the public about these things. So reach out to your communication staff if you're able to do it directly, speak at a public library, do those kinds of things.
Great. And Omar, bring us home.
I think, again, being transparent, and we shouldn't be afraid to explore and try challenging things with automated vehicles. But what we have to be cognizant of is that we need to be very transparent about where things are working and where they're not working. And so that is the way in which these vehicles will overcome the challenges and serve the public that we're trying to help.
Absolutely. Well, those 30 minutes went by really quickly, but Dan and Omar, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us and share the story of your project and your perspective today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to follow up with PAVE or either of the two panelists today, please reach out to us via our website at pavecampaign.org or any of our social media accounts at PAVE Campaign. We'll be sending a link out later today to everybody who registered that includes the full recording of this channel and a link to our podcast if you prefer to get your information that way. Thank you again as well to the audience for attending, submitting questions, and spreading the word. As they mentioned, feel free to check out their website and subscribe to their newsletter if you want more updates on this specific project. And we look forward to seeing you here at PAVE with the next few weeks as we discuss the topic of AVs in the city of tomorrow. Thank you all.